All right, so we're going to get started. I want to thank everybody for being here and joining us. We're very excited for this. And um, I'm going to, well, first of all, my name is Kai Teague. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a program officer for environmental stewardship at the College Fund, and then work alongside Leona, leading this initiative. And then we're working with Alfred Walking Bull, we're consulting with, who is like greatly supporting and doing a lot of the work in us getting this opportunity launched. And so I am going to share kind of a little bit of a reflection first, and then we're going to have Emily Whitehat, who is the VP of Programs, say something. And then we'll move into the session with Alfred. And I had mentioned earlier, Representative Heather Keeler is going to be joining us from Minnesota, which I'm very excited about as well. So we'll go ahead and get started. I did want to say that this morning before this session that I was praying about it, and I was kind of feeling anxious, and I was immediately like, I wanted to ask a question and just be like, please, like we want this to be good. And I was just paused, and I was like, I wanted to say thank you first. I was very appreciative because we have the opportunity to do this. And I started thinking about the knowledge that others bring, the knowledge that Alfred is sharing. And we had another speaker for our College Fund session, Donovan. And again, Heather joining us, and really appreciative. And I was thinking about how many of our Two-Spirit relatives have kept knowledge and held knowledge over time, even when they were being persecuted, even when people were attempting to erase them and get rid of them. And that while we have, most of us, a lot of us have fragmented understandings of what that means now, and that we're searching for it ourselves, that I really appreciate the fact that they were persistent in that. And because of that, we are here now, and that we have our relatives like Alfred and others to share with us. And so before I jumped into being like, please help us out, I was like, thank you, because you are, we already have been helped. We're already, that's why we're here. And so with that, again, we had a session on Monday with the College Fund, actually, with internally for our organization, and I said very similar things that I'm going to say today, but I made an acknowledgement to Emily Whitehat, who is the VP of Programs, which I mentioned, and the lead of our team. And I thanked her at that time, and I want to say thank you again, Emily. And in this space, I want to say it because it's really important to have people on administration, on administrative levels, and in leadership, to advocate and to support you. And so I appreciate everyone that's here, especially anyone from admin and leadership and TCU faculty and staff, thinking about students, but also thinking about yourselves. And, sometimes I'm going to say that it's not always necessary and we don't always want it, but sometimes our allies and our relatives act as shields for us. There might be things that we're going through, places that we might not be ready to advocate for ourselves. And I feel like that there are definitely moments, Emily, that you acted kind of as a shield, that you asked questions on my behalf, in kind of in consultation with me. And so it's just really important to have someone, especially in the workplace, to support us and to see us and acknowledge us, and help us out that way. And so with that, there's a lot of other people that have supported this work, along with Leona. So thank you again. And, that had me thinking about this myth that we do things alone, this myth that we succeed alone, and that we don't do anything alone. And I've been listening recently to a writer and poet named Ocean Vuong. And there's two quotes that they share. And one is entire nations are built on the myths of storytelling. And that it takes the story to harness the resources. And they were talking about language and language as our inheritance and how powerful language is and how powerful narratives and story is. And so, again, thinking about that myth that we do things alone, knowing that we don't. And again, thinking about the power of story to harness resources, be it good or bad. And so that kind of brings me into this other portion, and I'll try to kind of like sum it up a little bit and be a little quick. But to kind of step back and look at this broader narrative of the reason that we're in this moment right now, having this conversation, is that there have been a lot of myths told to all of us. And some of those come from, well, I want to say that what we're experiencing right now, those myths come from colonization. And in those, they attempt to eradicate our relationship to self, a relationship to place, understandings within how we are in relationship. And that primarily happens through attacks on land, on water, and through culture and language and our educational systems, through re-educating us. And that for the most part, that has happened in violent ways. It has been attacks upon our land, upon our bodies, upon our minds, upon our spirits. And that it's an entire system. And while it might made to be look like it's isolated incidents, it's not. It's a very comprehensive approach to attacking us. And so thinking about the spaces that we're in, educational spaces, and thinking about how education happens in silos. Again, for better or worse, education, like storytelling, the person that is telling that story has the ability to say how something is occurring, how it should take place, and why. And I'm going to share another quote from a show that I have been watching and refer to often. And one of the things that they talk about is they say that it's easy to knock people off through food and water and miseducation, and not one generation, but multiple generations. That they essentially what they do is that they make us die slowly by not understanding that we are in fact dying. And so the intent here is to take. It's to gain access to land, access to resources. And to do that, you have to claim dominance, you have to subjugate. And that has primarily been done through attacks on two-spirit people, on women, on elders, on children. And actually recently I was actually listening to an interview with Representative Keeler, and she was talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women, and the relationship between attacks on women and land. So when we think about when people try to isolate again, what's happening in the environment, what's happening with women, what's happening with two-spirit people, they're all interrelated, they're intersectional. When people try to tell you that they're not, I challenge you to challenge them. And so again, going back to this importance of language and how it holds perspective and it holds understanding. And that, I guess through that, again, that the impacts of the things that we have been told about ourselves, that we tell ourselves, has led us to where we are today, this moment, this conversation. And this is one thing actually I do want to share really quickly. While some of the things I'm sharing are kind of bigger, I want to share this like pretty logical example of how harm can be done. And given that you're all at tribal colleges, hopefully this is something that you can think more about in terms of, again, whoever it is, leadership, faculty, students, community members coming into your tribal college. I live in Poplar, Montana on the Fort Peck Reservation. A lot of our staff and team, myself included, we travel to rural communities, other tribal communities. And a lot of times, especially in rural communities, when you go to the restroom, there's the option for male and female. There's no in between. Sometimes there's a family restroom, but very rarely. This can be a dangerous situation for a person that identifies as trans, a person that identifies as the gender that they weren't assigned. Maybe they are transitioning. It can literally, we can be perceived as causing harm to someone else. Harm can be caused upon us. We can be persecuted. Someone could call the cops on us. So something as simple as that could actually completely change our lives. And so I just ask for you to think about that in the spaces that you're in. What does access look like? What do safe spaces look like? And so I guess I'll just end with this, that yes, this conversation is about learning to support our Two-Spirit relatives or LGBTQ plus relatives, but that it is not just for us, it is for all of our relatives. We are all relatives here. Even if you don't identify in that space, and we all suffer the loss of that knowledge, the loss of one another. And so again, going back to the narrative portion, we have the opportunity to create a new story, and one that actually isn't even new. It's quite old. And so that is part of, hopefully my hope of what we're attempting to do and support here. And so with that, again, I just want to say thank you for listening to me and my sharing. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Emily White Hat really quick to say something, and then we'll move forward. Thank you.
Good day, relatives. It's really good to see all of you. I'm Emily Whitehat, the Vice President of Programs, Sichangu Lakota. I come from the Hoyekiyapi Teoshpai in Rosebud, South Dakota. And what our Teoshpai has always been known for is that we wrap our hair with defiance. And that's a responsibility for those of us in our Teoshpai to really speak out, to bring visibility and to call out what's not happening, to support our relatives, but also to acknowledge the good things that are happening. And I'm fortunate today that we have my Misu. I call Alfred my Misu, my younger brother, because he's also from the Hoyekiyapi Teoshpai, and just so proud of the work that he's been able to do to bring visibility and representation to our relatives. My pronouns are Wia. In Lakota, that's a woman, and she, her in English. Our team recently at the College Fund had all of our name tags updated to the programs team to include our pronouns, because we wanted to be able to create we wanted to create visibility and let our relatives know as they interact with us that we see them. And that is just one of those many little steps that we can do to create those safe spaces. I appreciate the acknowledgement from Kai this morning, because as I reflected on this work for the last 5 years, when I was first asked to look at and to think about how to bring visibility to our Two-Spirit and LGBTQ plus relatives, I really had to think about how to use my place of privilege, my voice. And then as I grew into leadership at the College Fund, really felt a deep responsibility. Kai is my team member that I deeply support. And I also have, as I mentioned, Alfred as a relative from this community. But in my immediate family, my niece Winter was born into our family about 16, 17 years ago. And I really believe is transgender. And I really believe that she came into our family so that we would be able to bring voice and bring awareness and be able to learn and to think about how we can support our relatives. And I'm thankful for her and for Alfred. I encourage all of you in the work that you're doing to be vulnerable, to be able to share with your family members what you're learning. Sometimes it's hard to have the conversations, but I also encourage you to ask questions, not only to us, but to your own leadership about how you're supporting your students. I offer my team, our programs team, Kai and Leona are our contacts, but we have several team members on our team that really believe and support this work. We want to be able to do the best that we can to be good relatives to our tribal college partners. I also encourage you to vote in the upcoming elections. If you've been following your state legislatures for the last year, specifically the last couple years, they've passed several laws that have made it even harder for our Two-Spirit and LGBTQ plus relatives to be able to be visible, to be safe, and to be able to just function like the rest of us do in our regular society. If you're able to on your campus start to make changes around access to bathrooms, like for some of us, I identify as a straight female, like I don't think about that the way I know other relatives may think about that regularly. And it may seem like it's a hard change, but there's ways to do it, and we're always happy to visit about that. And the last thing I'll say is that our team is really thinking a lot about in the work that we do and the relationship to Indigenous methods. We're thinking a lot about the connection to land, as Kai mentioned, our responsibility and how we support kinship in the work that we do, because we really believe that we have a responsibility to support our relatives and their identity. As Indigenous people, as LGBTQ plus people, as relatives who may have disabilities, we have so many different ways that our relatives identify and responsibilities that they all carry. And we just really want to create the most inclusive spaces. So thank you, Kai, Leona, Alfred, and Heather for the work today. And thank you to all of our TCU partners and relatives that are taking the time today to be a part of this conversation. I know Alfred will go over the ground rules, but I do encourage you, if you are able, to please engage with us with your camera on. And we understand that you may not be able to, but we do encourage that if you're able. Pila Mayape.
Awesome. Alfred, would you like me to do an introduction real quick?
Sure. Yeah, we can do.
So I'm going to really quickly introduce Alfred, and I'm going to introduce Heather at the same time, just so that they can transition into next conversation. So thank you, Alfred, for being here. Alfred Walking Bull uses he, they pronouns. Alfred is a enrolled citizen of the Rosebud Sioux Tribe in South Dakota, but based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the ancestral homelands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe people. He has a 20-year background in journalism, communications, organizing, and facilitation. His approach to facilitation, evaluation, and communications is rooted in the Intercultural Development Continuum, a concept of the Intercultural Development Inventory, tailored to tailor developmentally appropriate curricula, exercise, reflection, and storytelling to meet the needs of his clients. That was development, like a lot of times. I just said that. Alfred's background also includes political organizing for elections, issues, and community. He identifies as gay, queer, two-spirit, and a person of faith and recovery. His hobbies include reading, designing, and percolating a perfect cup of coffee. I'm sure perfect is debatable, but and thank you again, Representative Keeler, for joining us so much. Heather has been involved in equity work her entire life. It's not work that she chose to start at any one specific time. Rather, for her, the work of equity is a way of life. Her formal education training started with an associate degree in marketing from Southeast Tech in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. From there, she pursued a bachelor's degree in project management from MSUM I'm not sure which university that is. My apologies.
It's Minnesota State University, Moorhead. I forget when we're working with
Moorhead.
regional people, I should spell that out. Thank
No
you.
problem. Thank you. After receiving her bachelor's degree, she earned a master's degree in educational leadership from MSUM. Beyond her formal education, Heather has participated in numerous trainings and workshops. A sample of these efforts includes the Blandin Foundation Community Leadership Training, the Bush Foundation's BushCon. Heather has also worked in many facets of equity work within the region. She led the Human Rights Task Force for Moorhead Area Public Schools, served as Vice Chair for Moorhead Native American Commission, developed programming that laid a foundation for the Moorhead School District to hire Director of Equity and Inclusion position. Brilliant. Heather has been a keynote speaker for over 100 events, sharing her Indigenous 101, stuff you didn't learn in K through 12. I should probably take that. Then diving into how to create a culturally infused organization. Representation matters, and showing up in these spaces to have honest conversations is extremely important. In November 2020, Heather was elected to the Minnesota House of Representatives for District 4A, representing Moorhead, Minnesota. This historic election cannot be underestimated, as she is the first Native LGBTQIA+ woman serving rural Minnesota in the legislature. It's crazy that that's the first. This momentous accomplishment became a reality due to Heather's unwavering commitment to foundational issues of education, equity, and healthcare for all. So that's awesome. And thank you. And I'll turn it over to you, Alfred.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Kai. Thank you, Kanke, Emily. Thank you, Leona. Hoyekiyapi. My name is Alfred Walking Bull, and I greet you with a good heart this morning. So I'm going to, there we go. I'm recording to the cloud, so wherever this saves, it's not my So our objectives for today, for you, for your purposes, are notice what you're not noticing along lines of gender and sexuality. So as my Tanke shared, going to the bathroom is one of those things that most folks don't ever consider as something that is a barrier for LGBT folk. Create a curiosity about Two-Spirit and LGBTQ people and communities. So as the asterisk indicates there, I was, when I was working in a predominantly white organization, shortly before I was let go, one of the things they shared was, "You don't seem to be very curious." And I said, well, actually, curiosity is defined as interrogation from your perspective. Asking questions and poking at things is what you consider curiosity. For my people that I grew up with, observation is also part of curiosity. So as you're thinking about that, observation is also part of curiosity. So creating a curiosity about Two-Spirit and LGBTQ communities. And then begin developing an executable 3 to 6 month work plan on how to explore Two-Spirit and LGBTQ identity and incorporate learnings into your work process. So really small order, really nothing too big for you to consider for your work going forward. Right now, I think Kai, am I the host? Okay, all right. Well, I will share with you a quick video here that we had queued up. Just a moment. Featuring Geo Neptune, who is a Two-Spirit activist on the East Coast. I believe they're Passamaquoddy from Maine. And it's just going to go over some very basic concept and terminology. And again, apologies if you have, if you know a lot of this.
Let me just read it really.
There are some folks who are new to this work, so we're trying to be as inclusive as we can. So here we go. Computer audio. Here we go.
Good. Two-spirit one more time. Though the label has only been used since the 90s, the concept of the two-spirit is something Indigenous groups have identified with for centuries. But what does two-spirit actually mean, and where does it come from? So what is two-spirit? It's an umbrella term that bridges Indigenous and Western understandings of gender and sexuality. You may recognize it as the two that sometimes appears on the end of LGBTQ2. There are many definitions and understandings of two-spirit, and each is nation-specific. The term was intentionally introduced by Native people with the goal of finding common ground and helping educate about traditional teachings in a contemporary context. The Two-Spirit Society of Denver offers the following definition. Two-spirit refers to another gender role believed to be common among most, if not all, First Peoples of Turtle Island, North America, one that had a proper and accepted place within Native societies. This acceptance was rooted in the spiritual teachings that say all life is sacred. So how did the term two-spirit first come about? In 1990, in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, at the 3rd annual Native American Gay and Lesbian Gathering, the term two-spirit was proposed and affirmed by consensus. The word was a potential solution to what Native scholars and activists called the problem of naming, or making the many different sexual and gender identities that fall under the two-spirit umbrella legible across Native and non-Native cultures alike. For example, to illustrate the diversity of meanings that two-spirit contains, consider the following. In Lakota, the word winkte means to be as a woman and refers to two-souled Lakota people who transgress boundaries of gender from what may be considered male to female. In Dene, nadlehe means those who transform and refers to one of 4 separate genders: masculine, feminine, masculine, masculine, feminine, masculine, and feminine, feminine. Each gender has its own word in the Dene language. And those are just 2 nation-specific examples. There are so many more. Each nation's understanding of gender and sexual diversity is different and grounded in specific spiritual beliefs. Although all nations don't have a concept of two-spirit people, across those Indigenous nations that do, two-spirit people were historically held in high regard and often considered sacred or divine, holding important positions like matchmakers, medicine people, or warriors on the front lines of battle. Many two-spirit people perform roles traditionally assigned to both men and women. Witwa, a famous two-spirit of the Zuni or Ihumana, was known to take part in masculine tribal matters and feminine tribal matters, and was even sent as an official Zuni delegate to Washington, D.C. Part of the reason two-spirit was adopted at the 1990 conference was because much of the written record on the Indigenous nations of North America begins with European contact. For instance, the writings of Jesuit priests from the 1600s contain references to bertiches, which means kept boy in French, to refer to those who embodied both male and female genders. These writings often focus negatively on perceived cross-dressing among the Anishinaabe. The term is not only inaccurate in that it projects a European understanding of gender, but is widely considered pejorative by natives. Two-spirit was an attempt at self-determination across linguistic barriers, because the existing language, foreign and imposed violently on the Indigenous peoples of North America, was both offensive and deeply colonial in its gaze. European colonizers imposed homophobia, rigid binary gender roles, and misogyny under the guise of civilizing Indigenous people through the Christian tradition in residential schools and beyond. As a result, Indigenous people were robbed not only of their land, but of their spiritual traditions and way of life regarding two-spirit people. Many nations came to forbid and punish two-spirit unions and self-expression. As recently as 2004, Kathy Reynolds and Dawn McKinley, 2 Cherokee women in Tulsa, Oklahoma, attempted to marry under tribal law, setting off a convoluted legal battle with serious political and social implications. The 2 were thrust into the spotlight against their wishes and became instant public symbols of the battle for two-spirit rights under tribal law. The Cherokee tribe is the 2nd largest in the US. Although they were granted the right to marry, the decision to issue them a marriage license was soon challenged and led to a tribal law declaring that a union was to be between a man and a woman. Eventually, in 2016, the law was overturned. By that time, a wider cultural shift had taken place, both outside of and within the Cherokee Nation. In recent years, many Native people are returning to their Two-Spirit traditions as a way to heal from the injustices the American colonial project has visited upon their ancestors and traditions. In 2011, the first known US Two-Spirit powwow was organized by the Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirits. Since then, powwows honoring Two-Spirits have been held in Montana and Kansas. And in March of 2017, the largest powwow in the US, the Gathering of Nations, honored Two-Spirit people during its grand entry. Two-Spirit identity is resilient and precious. It has survived centuries of colonial violence and prejudice. These sacred ways of knowing live on amongst Native youth seeking to know more about themselves, elders who have kept the traditions alive in spite of the odds, and anyone in between. It should go without saying, but Two-Spirit is not a poetic way for non-Native LGBTQ people to express themselves. We're looking at you, Jason Mraz. It is, however, a sacred tradition among the first peoples of this land we call Turtle Island that all of its inhabitants should know about and respect.
Right. For folks who don't know, there was a singer-songwriter from the early 2000s who folks were really, I remember I listened to his music. His name is Jason Mraz, and he came out a couple of years ago as bisexual and instantly adopted the Two-Spirit identity and didn't know that that was specifically for Indigenous folks. So, and he is white, and it was not a good look for anybody involved. So that's something that's ours. So back to our program, where we are now. So this is, I'm sharing a little bit about who I am and why you're listening to me. So here are some of my living credentials. These are just what I do in time that's not compensated with money. This is kind of how I really spend my time and really have learned my expertise on what it is that I do and how I can help folks in whatever developmental journey they're in. And this is where I'm from. In case folks are unfamiliar with the Sichontu Makoche, it's down here on the Rosebud Reservation in the middle of South Dakota. It's a beautiful place, and everyone takes a picture of that photo before we leave back to our urban settings, just to tell the people. And we make it our profile photo on Facebook for months. That's the sky where I'm from. It's a beautiful place. This is a community that I grew up in called Upper Cutmeat Community on the western edge of the reservation. This is the river that I played in as a child. It's the White River in Ghost Talk Park. And this is a 10-year-old photo. Facebook reminded me that it was a 10-year-old photo when I used to work for the tribe for Rosebud Fair. For folks who had just joined us at the beginning, Emily and I were kind of, Emily, Leona, and I were kind of figuring out how are we going to get over not being home for Rosebud Fair. So they're going to go get an Indian taco. I might too. So, these are the official credentials that make me qualified to talk about what I talk about in my daily life. Those are the places that I've worked, and part of the nature of the work that I've done has been in communications, organizing, and journalism. So that's a little bit about me. This is the company that I work right now. It's called Team Dynamics, and it's where I really honed how to talk about intercultural differences and intercultural development. And so really love working here. And if you ever get a chance to learn more, feel free to check us out. Where I learned a lot of integral stuff for LGBTQ identity was at PFund Foundation. PFund is a regional community foundation here in the upper Midwest, and we fund the states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin. Any LGBTQ scholars or organizations that need some funding is where we tried to fill in the gaps. And the gaps were many. So back in 2015, when I first started there, my executive director really tried to make the case for LGBTQ funding. And a lot of what we got back was a lot of disbelief and incredulity. They said, surely your data is flawed, or there's something that's not right here. We heard that LGBTQ people were fine. You got married, you seem to be fine. And we had to kind of take a different developmental approach rather than just hitting them with facts and figures. And so we launched the Fairness and Philanthropy study as a wing of the Better Outcomes Initiative. And that's when we learned how to talk about LGBTQ issues in a developmentally appropriate way so that people would hear and believe and be moved to act to fund LGBTQ folks. And so some acknowledgements that are important to me as we begin this work. What I'm going to say here is always subject to change. The LGBTQ community has been an evolving community for as long as we've had kind of an organized presence within the modern age, and has always been a part of every society and culture. So what you hear today may need some updating in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So that's not because anyone did anything wrong or taught you anything wrong. It's just the nature of change and evolution. Here's some key terms that you probably already know. LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. Those are all kind of what we talk about when we talk about the alphabet soup of LGBTQ. And when we talk about the plus, and again, these slides will be made available to you and the terminology will be made available to you. So if you need to take notes, those will be available to you later. The plus is where we get into questioning, intersex, and two-spirit. This is kind of where we talk about why it's important to talk about intersex folks right now is particularly with the fall of Roe versus Wade at the federal level. The term pregnant persons and people with uteruses has been used to make sure that it's more inclusive of intersex and transgender folk who have the ability to be pregnant, but do not identify as women. And so when we talk about pregnant persons and people with uteruses, it's important to remember that it's expansive to be inclusive, not to shut anyone out. So that's kind of why we talk about it in those terms. And two-spirit, as Gio gave, is kind of just our part of this universe. More terms, asexual, agender are people who generally do not experience any sexual attraction or any gender identity. Cisgender, that you'll hear often pronounced cis, is a term to describe a person whose gender identity matches the biological sex they were assigned at birth. So you were born, the doctor saw you and said, this is a boy, this is a girl, and you still identify as a man or a woman, you are cisgender. Non-binary is any number of identities on the gender identity expression that are not that, and include many different terms. When I was at PFund Foundation, we opened up the how do you identify on your gender box in our forms to just be an open text field. And we had so much more data than we had before on how people were identifying their gender. So all of that is important in the background of the key concepts beyond this nomenclature. So when we talk about gender identity and sexual orientation and the gender binary, they're all different things. So there's a tendency to assume that just because one is lesbian or trans or lesbian or gay or bisexual, then there's some gender identity confusion that might happen there. So I just wanted to parse this out for you. Gender identity is a person's deep-seated internal sense of who they are, and which may not necessarily reflect on the outside. A sexual orientation is a person's feelings of attraction toward other people. So so it's about who they're loving, who they're having sex with, and the identity of the people that they're caring for in that realm. And so on the gender binary is what we talk about when we say non-binary, trans, intersex folks. Gender binary is the idea that there is only masculine or feminine, man or woman. And so that is kind of a difficult concept for a lot of people to jump when we talk about gender identity being different from just man or just woman. And so this is the harder part. All of that is against the backdrop of misogyny and transmisogyny. So misogyny is the hatred of, contempt for, or prejudice against women. Transmisogyny is a flavor of that, but is specifically directed toward trans women and was coined by Julia Serrano in 2007 in her book, Whipping Girl. And so a lot of this, particularly in Indian country, we know from firsthand experience. I know for those of you who work at tribal colleges and universities who are working in those communities, understand that misogyny is a very real thing. And it's reflected in missing and murdered Indigenous people, missing and murdered Indigenous women, missing murdered Indigenous relatives, missing murdered Indigenous women and Two-Spirit. So it's one of the concepts that are important to acknowledge, because when we talk about homophobia, when we talk about transphobia, when we talk about all of those kinds of concepts, it's against the backdrop of how we are taught to feel and think and express our opinions about women. And that applies to women as well. There's internalized misogyny as well. So it's important to understand where this all comes from and why this is all kind of parsed out for folks. And why does it matter? It matters because the evolution of terminology is a changing journey. So there was a time when our community was referred to as GLBT, and we had to combat our own misogyny, especially after the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. So for folks who might remember, as early as 1981, there were the AIDS epidemic started, and the Reagan administration denied that there was any kind of problem. So lesbian women and gay men didn't really interact because we have our own flavor of misogyny within the community. And so at that time, they didn't really interact. And so the gay men and the trans women started dying of this disease that the government was not funding and did not prioritize. And so we were, as a community, just kind of left to care for ourselves. Right? Where else in the face of federal funding might that apply in Indian country, right? That's a familiar tune. So the community kind of came together through that crisis. And so the lesbian women kind of stepped up a lot of caretaking and a lot of activism to kind of get us through that part. So, we decided, let's deconstruct our misogyny and allow the L's to go first, the lesbians to go first. And so to now, as we're finding out more how we're not finding out, but as more witness is coming to light about how we're treating queer and Two-Spirit and trans and intersex folk, right? The terminology might be changing within the next 5, 10 to 15 to 20 years to be QTI to BLG or GLB, right? And so again, it's an ever-changing and evolving terminology that we need to check in about every now and then, and that's why it matters. So some of the current landscapes, this is of what's going on. This is just some data that I pulled from the Williams Institute. It's a really great resource. You should check it out. It's williamsinstitute.law.ucla.edu. They do a lot of studies and have a lot of good data to kind of figure out what is going on in the LGBTQ community in the United States. And I think for folks who know me, I think I really get into data. I'm a bit of a spreadsheet nerd, so this is my favorite part, is when we do like the maps and the bar graphs and everything. So this is where LGBTQ people are, and this also comes with an asterisk that LGBTQ people are in 99% of all U.S. counties. So we're everywhere. It's just that the concentrations are a little higher in some places than others. When I was living back home, I for sure was in Todd County here, right there in the middle of South Dakota. So we were everywhere. And this is a breakdown of kind of the demographics and age and the LGBTQ people raising children, gender. It's a mostly woman identified community, not raising children, and predominantly white, then Latinx, Black, and other people of color. The age distribution, ages 18 to 24, 30% identify are 18 to 24, which is really encouraging. I think that means that more youth are coming out as they're encountering the world. And here's some employment and educational attainment statistics. So most LGBTQ people, well, I should say 40% have completed a high school education, some college and bachelor's and postgrad. And food insecurity is the most striking statistic that I saw. 27% of LGBTQ people are food insecure. And so that's something to, when we get into it, like there are real policy reasons for that. And this is the state rankings. So like I said, we're in 99% of counties, but here are the places where we are the most in terms of percentage of the population. And so you'll see a lot of states with tribal communities in there: New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, California, Nevada, Oregon, right? And so where LGBTQ people are, they're also Indigenous people. When we talk about the Two-Spirit data, this is what it breaks down in terms of, it's a little more balanced when it comes to the gender binary, as we talked about, male or female, and raising and not raising. See, that increase, that's very fascinating to me, because as I think we talked about on Monday, Two-Spirit relatives tend to receive a lot more caretaking roles within tribal communities. I know I for sure helped to raise my brother's children, and now I get to help raise their children, my grandchildren. And so that's a wonderful data point that we can really look at in terms of what that means for LGBTQ generations in tribal communities. And yeah, and the age distribution is a lot more, it's very encouraging to see that ages 39 to 49, 35 to 49 are just as high as they are in youth. I think that's encouraging because it means we're sticking around. And the educational attainment, unemployment, uninsured, and food insecure and income levels are a little more drastic when it gets after high school. And this is where I am, some college. So I'm in that demographic as well. And so some current legislation, this is just a quick snapshot of what anti-LGBTQ legislation looks like across the United States. You'll see Tennessee and various parts of the South are have a higher prevalence of anti-LGBTQ legislation. New Mexico and Arizona, Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Washington, Idaho, Minnesota. There's still some, so where LGBTQ people and Indigenous people are, we're experiencing a lot more attack on the legislative side. And I'll share the link to that data when we're finished. So I just wanted to touch base and say it's important to get specific, but you don't have to know all of this to get a good grade, right? Like this is just the very beginning of understanding. So when we talk about all of the terms for what Two-Spirit identity is, indigiqueer, nadle, and linkde, and so what are some other terms for LGBTQ Indigenous people that you know of that are used in a respectful or descriptive way in your tribal community? Yeah, and so that's something to consider. And so that's my part of the of the data dump. So please, again, you're humans in bodies. That's a lot to take in. And I thank you so much for joining me on that part of it. If you need to stretch, if you need to crack your neck, whatever you need to do to get that information processed through you. I'm a person who believes that we process information in our mind, in our heart, and in our body as well. So when I'm listening to challenging information, I really have to stretch afterward and just kind of let my body crackle and pop a little bit. I also turned 40 this year, so that's happening a lot more. So I'm just very happy to be here with you all. Now I will turn it over to Representative Heather Keeler.
Thank you. I don't know if we need this slide up because I don't know that I have anything really fancy on the slides. I'd rather actually be back on the home screen. So I'm going to go back to kind of what Emily had said and the idea that we're all in this space together. We're going to be sharing, I know that that was a lot of data. I'm actually going to be sharing a lot about who I am in this work, in my life, in the challenges that I face as an Indigenous queer person every day. And so I'm going to re-ask that we turn on our cameras if possible, and we're here and engaged with each other. You know, I keep saying in spaces when I do conversations that microaggressions are real. And if we're just on in the background being tuned in, I know that we're all busy, but if I'm going to be here sharing really important, deep emotional pieces of myself for the next 20 minutes, it would be really nicely received if I'm looking at humans on the other end rather than dark screens. So we'll sit in that space for a minute, and thank you for sharing all that data and information to get us into the space. I kind of feel like I'm the outcome of a lot of that data, right? I mean, I'm an enrolled member. I'm a Ihangtawan. I'm an enrolled member of the Alfred Sioux Tribe with lineage to Eastern Shoshone. So both my mom and my dad are Indigenous. I grew up off the reservation. And I say that, I was one of the first in my families to grow up off the reservation because at the time I was really mad at my mom for the work that she did because I never fit in anywhere. And, if you grew up as an urban Indian kid, I didn't look around and see anybody who looked like me. And then when I would go back to Lake Andes with my home and my family and my relatives, like I didn't really belong there either. But my mom worked for 20 years in the state of South Dakota building the Medicaid program. So I don't know if you all remember Medicaid back in the day when we had like actual purple slips that you'd have to go to your primary care doctor just to take it over to get an x-ray. Like it was the first glimpse as a 6-year-old girl that I knew that the healthcare system wasn't set up and designed for people like us. After that, I tried to think about my future. And as early as 3rd grade, in education settings, my teacher would say, I remember the first argument I had was going into what a lot of people refer to as Thanksgiving. And I was supposed to color a picture of the red man, like killing all of the villagers. And I said, I'm not going to do this. Like I was in 3rd grade and got all the way up to the superintendent. And he was like, you'll fail 3rd grade. And me and my mom were like, cool, bet I'll fail 3rd grade for not coloring a picture that's like not true of how I believe my people are. And so when I say I've been an advocate my whole entire life, I feel like, the system's forced me to be a voice, whether it was working really close with my mom, whether it was being vocal and utilizing the one thing that the creator gave me. I can't make earrings and I can't sew, but I can sure use my voice to talk about things. And so from a really early age, I've been sharing, my story because that's the one that I know best. And so when I was in high school, I remember going and trying to sign up because I wanted to go to college. I heard everybody else talk about it. It was something that my family hadn't really experienced. And my counselor kept erasing my name off of the chalkboard. A chalkboard, not that old, but I mean, kind of, it was a chalkboard. And she came to me and she said, well, you're Indian, you're just gonna go work at the casino anyways. And I believed her. My math teacher said, well, because you're Indian, you're bad at math. All of you are bad at math. I believed that. I tried to go to college and I failed out the very first semester. I went with that mind frame. I believed that mind frame. Nobody there was telling me that that was any different. And so that was my first experience with higher education. failed, right? Like, so I went out into the world. I was a nanny in New York. I traveled all over because I really, at that moment in time, was really looking to understand who I was. You know, I don't know if any of you live in an intersectionality world, but walking around in the world as an Indigenous woman is one thing. You know, we get criticized and stigmatized and hunted after regularly just for who we are. I remember my dad telling me when I went to try to get my first apartment, he said, try not to be Native when you go in to get an apartment, because like that could affect them letting you lease an apartment. And I don't know if any of you have experienced things like that, but I was like, Dad, how am I supposed to do that? Like, this is who I am. And so in middle school and high school, I started to know that I sat in a really unique lens of life. You know, it kind of started out like, well, you're always best friends with all the guys, and the guys get you, and you know, you're not really friends with the girls, and kind of in this weird space. And I knew I was experiencing what I call soul sexual, because I connect with people in our souls. I don't like labels of what everybody else tries to give me, but because I lived in that space, I attempted suicide twice in high school. I kind of say one was because I was Indigenous, and the other was because I didn't know how to outwardly express who I was in the most inner pieces of my soul, and what I believe the Creator set me on a path to do. It just wasn't something we were talking about in the 90s. And so went out into the world, and I kind of always thought, I just don't see people who look like me. You know, I ended up getting 4 diplomas. So I have my high school degree, an associate's, a bachelor's, and a master's. And I've never sat in a classroom with an Indigenous professor or teacher ever. You know, even the schools that I went to, it was a struggle to even find other students who looked like me, let alone, you know, lived in this world of identifying as me as well. And so it felt really, really lonely. And it's scary and it's terrifying. And then I go back to the teachings of my family. We really believe in the eagle mentality, and that eagles fly higher. We fly closer to the spirit world, and we also tend to fly alone. My dad would say, you know, if you're an eagle and you soar like an eagle, you don't play with chickens, you know. And it was like, I really took that on as the responsibility that the Creator put me in this space to fly like an eagle. And a lot of times that means that it's different elevations, it's different conversations, it's different spaces, and it tends to be lonely. But as I got into my 30s, I had been working in Indian education. And what that to me meant was I was able to sit in living rooms with my families and really ask them, you know, what are your struggles with education outside of academic rigor, right? Like, it's always like math was hard or science was hard, but the number one thing that everybody said was, my kids are going to school and they're not seeing anybody who looks like them. The curriculum isn't talking about them. Nobody's there to support them. And the language that we use, we smudge every morning and go to school, and the SRO is always called because they think they're smoking weed. Like, it was all of these things that I'm sure, you know, you all maybe have or haven't had conversations with your community members about. And so there was this moment in time when I tried to pass Indigenous Peoples Day in our schools. Like, to me, it didn't seem like a big deal. Like, can we bring light to the beauty in my culture in our school systems? And the superintendent told me no. And now I know we've all only spent like 10 minutes together, but the one thing I'll tell you is I don't take no for an answer. I try to figure out like what or who is the no. And so I found out that they had said, well, as a school district, we're not going to do anything that the city doesn't recognize. Okay, bet. So that's when I decided to fill out the application and advocate for myself to get on the Human Rights Commission. And I did. And in the first meeting, I said, we need to have Indigenous Peoples Day in the city of Moorhead. Went through the process and passed it. And I even remember that day saying, like, I made a Facebook post that said, everybody come to the courthouse. And I want to run through this with you because I want to point something out at the end. I invited everybody. It wasn't just Natives in my community. It was literally everybody. We filled every seat in city council, in city council hall. And it had never been a place I had been before. You know, as an Indigenous person, I've never been invited to the table to like learn how to be a leader in my community. Like, that's not something that like anybody ever offered me. And I remember the city manager calling me and saying, like, why are you putting together a Facebook post? Like, most of us are in favor of this. This is probably going to go through. And it made me pause. Like, nothing I said on there said this is like an angry movement. It was really just inviting people to come be a part of the process of change. I wanted to invite people to the table with me to know what it was like to create change that was meaningful to our next generation in our community. But the government officials, just because we were Native, trying to get people in seats, looked as though it was a conflict. And it made me pause to think, why is that the embedded feeling? Like, why, just because Natives want to fill a room for something, it has to be this point of conflict with the government? Well, because the truth is, that's what it's always been, right? Like the government, and I think we mentioned it earlier, like we always say in writing policy, that when we write policy, we always have to look through the lens of unintentional consequences as well. And so for 39 years of my life before I was elected, I lived in a world that wanted to believe that state and federal policies were made just like with these unintended consequences that accidentally happened to Indian country. Because I think we have to live in that world to believe that people aren't this mean, right? Like policies aren't this mean. In my first 2 years of serving as a state representative, I quickly learned that it is extremely intentional. The harm to our communities through education systems, through healthcare, through housing, through language, it is has been, and still to this day is very continuing this harm. And so what I did after I passed Indigenous Peoples Day, I was in the middle of grad school at the time, did my practicum on, like, I took those conversations I had in the community and did a practicum around them for my master's program. And again, found that the top reasons that people in my community were not successful in academics is because of lack of representation, lack of access to food, housing, and healthcare. And so I was gonna run for school board because Moorhead has never had a Native American school board member. And so it was like, oh my gosh, I really hate when people like know who I am. Like I'm a doer, like I just like to volunteer in the community. I just like to go do the behind the scenes thing. So I had to get over the bridge of like, if I'm gonna run for school board, people are gonna see me, they're gonna know my name and they're gonna ask me questions. And so what happened is like, I posted it on Facebook, just to kind of get the word out there that I was going to run. Well, what that did is I think it opened up the door for other people to ask me to do more. And the individual who was in this seat before me, Representative Ben Lean, announced his retirement really late in the year. And so February of 2020, I decided, well, shit, I keep telling all my kids, sorry for the language, in Indian education, like, there's going to be a time in your life when you have to step outside of your comfort zone and find this massive amount of courage to do something that you know is going to make a difference, but you're terrified to do. And I would say that all the time. I used our Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan as the highest elected state official as an Indigenous woman. She's our Lieutenant Governor. And I used her story as an example in my classrooms with my kids. So when 20 women and youth reached out to me and encouraged me to run for a state seat, I was like, you've lost your mind, right? Like, why would anybody want somebody like me? Like I think as people of underserved communities, we always feel like somebody else could do it better, or I'm not good enough to do it, or what if I don't do it right, or I don't have enough time. I'm a single mom, y'all. I have a 6-year-old and a 16-year-old, and I live 3.5 hours away from the Capitol. Like, all the logistics don't make sense for how I can do this job, but I truly believe that my next generations need me to do this job. So I ran, and of course, like 2 white straight guys decided that they should run against me, like white straight guys, like we have enough of them in the government, right? We don't need any more. So I had to beat them twice. I had to beat them in the endorsement process, and they challenged me in the primary, and I won. And I won pretty significantly. And so I serve in the state House of Representatives as, well, the first Indigenous queer Greater Minnesota member, but also my 6-year-old has 2 moms. And so I enter into a space not only as, you know, who I am, but also, you know, the life that my son goes through, having to walk into spaces. His name's Elliot, and he's so funny because he has 2 L's and 2 T's in his name. So he's going into 1st grade and he just tells everybody, I have 2 L's, 2 T's, and 2 moms. And it's like, that's just how he rolls, you know, in life. And it's so heartbreaking to see people, the very first thing they say back is, no, but who's your dad? Where's your dad? And it's like, that's never been, you know, that's not what it is. And so I take my life lens, my life experience, and all these conversations to the table of law and legislation, and we make policies. And, you know, I went in like just wanting to do all these really big things because we hope that we can change the world. And then you realize that the way that state government is set up is so complicated. And in the state of Minnesota, well, up until Virginia, we were the only split legislature, which meant our governor was Democratic, and I would say moderate Democratic governor. And then we have the House, which the Democrats are in control. And then we have the Senate, which the Republicans are in control. So as you know, that creates a lot of tension. It doesn't allow us to do some of these really big movements that we want to do, moving out, you know, into Indian country. Minnesota is 100% ceded treaty territory. We have 11 sovereign nations. And our culture is one of the most beautiful things about this state. We just forget to embrace it, acknowledge it, and include it. So one of the things I said when I started to run is that I wanted to be focused on cultural revitalization, because everybody will say, like, what's your biggest bill? What's your biggest policy, right? That's not how this works. And I kept saying cultural revitalization, cultural revitalization. Well, then I was down at Hoyekiyapi this weekend, and somebody mentioned it's not cultural revitalization, because revitalization happens when something is absolutely gone. Our language is not gone. We are not gone. Our beliefs are not gone. So it's actually cultural normalization. We need to normalize who we are in these spaces. And so that's what I do. And I've always hesitated to introduce myself as an Indigenous queer mom, because it's always kind of come back with a lot of harm, a lot of negativity. You know, I fit in the data of violence against women. You know, I've gone through a lot of help to try to work myself through the trauma that has happened not only to me, but historically to us, and then the continued trauma that I go through like every day in this work. And so a couple things for you, because you all work at tribal colleges, you're all part of TCUs, right? Okay, so a couple things is I want you to know how important your work is. So the first thing is I want to say thank you. I am a huge advocate for higher education. I am a huge believer that education is a lifelong opportunity. I went back to school for my bachelor's and my master's in my 30s because I had to wait till I could afford school again. I had to wait till it was a good time for me. But tribal schools offer a really unique thing because they're within the communities. We're not asking our kids to leave and go other places into communities that sometimes feel unsafe and unfamiliar. And so one of the things that I did, I serve. So when you're in the state legislature, you serve on different committees and you advocate for seats at those tables. And so I serve on education policy, because I believe that we need to have inclusive curriculum in K-12, which means like Indigenous education for all, not just let Indian education do cultural things. Like every single student should know and learn about pieces of Indigenous history. Here in Minnesota, President Lincoln ordered the mass hanging of Dakota 38 plus 2 men down in Mankato, and we don't talk about it like at all. Not only that, President Lincoln is the picture that is behind the Speaker of the House on the chamber floor, which tells you just in general the lack of knowledge, which then goes into decision making. And so the long-term goal of mine is I would love to be the Speaker of the House for many reasons, but one, I want to change that dang picture to something more like this. And so one of the first things that happened when I got into state legislature is something that I want you to take back and reflect on, whether you have student organizations or student senates or how you refer to people. because every committee meeting we went into, everybody was saying, Madam Chair or Mr. Chair, or Madam Speaker or Mr. Speaker. Well, okay, well, what if we have non-binary individuals in these leadership spaces? We haven't even taken into consideration. It's basically saying to individuals who don't identify as either of those that this leadership role is not really designed for you. So that's the first thing that was like in my mind, like we need to change that. Why can't you just call me Chair Keeler or Speaker Keeler? Like, why does there have to be a gender like identifier at the beginning of that? Well, because Western society has taught us that's, you know, that's like the appropriate manner to address people. So kind of in your knowledge nugget, okay, hold on, y'all. The Oscar Mayer Wiener hot dog truck just drove by my window and I like have to pause for a minute, like, how cool is that? Sorry. Gosh. So look at things like that within your systems, or even if you're volunteering in other spaces, you know, in your community, like, do we have gender identifying lead-ins in spaces that are unnecessary? Because one, it increases the likelihood of, you know, messing up, you know, not calling somebody by the right identity that they live in, because I am a true believer that all of us, it is a human right for all of us to live authentically and as beautiful as we believe we are. And you don't have a right to tell me I can't do that. Nobody has the right to tell anybody else that they can't do that. And so that's one of the first things that I recognized in leadership roles. And then now as I'm out, you know, we do that with our county commissioners, Madam Chair. We do that with our mayor, it's Madam Mayor. Like, think about that and think about how maybe that in your spaces can make a difference. The other thing is that funding. So one of the things that I did, because I'm kind of ballsy and I love when people tell me no, especially when we're lawmakers. And so I also sit on higher education, and I ended up on the conference committee, which if you know much about legislation, and one of the things we'll talk about next is like how does legislation work? But I ended up on the conference committee, which means out of all the members, there were only 5 members in the entire House that end up on this conference at the end of the year that decide what turns into bills. So in the state of Minnesota, we have U of M, our university system, which is like ask anybody else, and it's like this hierarchy, this wonderful university system, right? Then we have the Minnesota state system, which is where I graduated from, which is MSUM, and there's 36 campuses across the state. And then there's our tribal colleges. And we give billions of dollars to these other education systems, right? And it's like, oh, well, we'll do Native American outreach. And I used to work as the director for multicultural recruitment. And there's not one school in the state of Minnesota who has somebody hired specifically to do Indigenous recruitment. And so I didn't give any of the money in our line items to the university or the Minnesota state system. And I challenged our state and I added a line item for $1 million for each of our tribal colleges in the state of Minnesota, because it's something that we've never done. And everybody sat and said, well, we can't give money to the tribes. And I said, why? Because we're the lawmakers, y'all. Like, those are just reasons. Those are just excuses. Like, we can absolutely make it happen. And so it was really meaningful that we were able to do that. And we did that in a bipartisan way because relationships matter. And that's kind of one of the other things that I want you all to take away in this work, that you will mess up. You will say something you weren't supposed to say. You'll say something as we're learning and you're learning, like that. At the end of the day, genuine, honest relationships are filled with grace, are filled with forgiveness, and are filled with the reality that we have a lot of understanding, like learning is a lifelong opportunity. So have grace on yourself as you're learning and you're making these changes. But I believe that we were able to get that funding in for tribal colleges because I had built relationships to explain who we are and why these universities are so important in our communities. So isn't that cool? That's pretty cool. So the other thing that we did around being understanding in our LGBTQIA communities is murdered and missing Indigenous women, murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, for a long time was the epidemic that we talked about. And in the state of Minnesota, we had created a task force. It was one of the things that got passed before I was elected. We had a task force around MMIW and the needs that we had. And so when we got that task force report back and I was elected, and at the table, we switched it to MMIR because we're all relatives to each other. That doesn't have, again, that gender lead in at all. It's not just assuming that it's women and girls, because the truth is our two-spirit relatives have more harm done on them in these massive ways that we can't overlook. And so we really fought from a legislative lens to start calling it MMIR, a Murdered and Missing Indigenous Relatives Office. And in my first year, we worked with Senator Mary Kunesh over in the Senate. And again, because we have Peggy Flanagan as our lieutenant governor, we passed into legislation and now have an executive director and have the first and the only MMIR office that's a state funded office in the entire United States. And we set the precedent for that. We set the precedent that this is a requirement, and it has to be inclusive, and it has to be something that impacts all of our relatives. And that is going back to the belief of what we talked about, that the two-spirit idea is actually like one of the most beautiful things in our culture. And I get a lot of kids that come to me because I now am very open about who I am. Because 1,000 people might hate me because of that, but I do believe that there's one Heather out in the world that just needs me to be bold enough about who I am so that they can be bold enough about who they are. And they'll come up to me and it's like, well, everybody says it's so bad and everybody says it's so awful. And I was like, well, that's because they live in a whitewashed world. Like, they're not understanding the actual beauty, kind of this higher elevated level of a two-spirit individual, and especially in ceremony. And around the way that this is identified as something that is more beautiful in a lot of our tribal nations. And I wish that that was the message that our kids are hearing, but they're not. And so that's why I continue to work in that education policy space. I also am the vice chair of Preventing Homelessness. We know that our two-spirit LGBTQIA individuals have higher rates of homelessness, and we know that that impacts their access to education. I don't know, but I'm willing to bet you all have had a story with a student that dropped out of school or had to stop out because of housing issues or because of food or because they had to go take care of a relative, and then distance became an issue, access became an issue. And so, I think that our voices are brought up and legislation is created because representation matters. And it's really, it feels kind of weird for me to say a lot of those things would have probably never happened had I not been at the table, because I say all the time, are you sure we're thinking about this so that those unintended or intentional consequences don't continue to impact our communities? And so that's kind of where I am. That's what I've done. That's what I hope to continue to do. But I want to let all of you know how important it is for you to get engaged. And I'm not going to make this isn't like your political pitch, like get out and vote, but it kind of is, right? Like, I don't know if you've seen, I'm not going to assume that you're all up to date on what the Supreme Court has been doing in general, but they've been having a lot of decisions and a lot of rulings that impact rights to women, but also impact our sovereign rights. And like ICWA, like I'm a licensed ICWA mom. I have taken in almost 20 newborns into my life, to help them be loved by a family who may similarly look like them. But that's on the line. Our sovereign rights to our land is on the line. And so it is absolutely, now is the time for you to engage. And one of the hardest things I see in Minnesota is in some of our tribal communities, we don't have great voter turnout because the indigenous population will say to me, Heather, we don't vote because we don't get involved in the white man's government. And that's fine. I completely understand that and I respect that. But I also know that this white man government is negatively impacting your life, your community, your schools, your students. And so you can either choose to get involved or not. they're going to keep making decisions over your rights and your access to these things. And so I'm not going to tell you, I don't know even where you are. So I can't sit here and tell you who to engage with or engage for. But the bottom line is nobody can sit in a neutral space anymore. And I'm going to mirror the message that I had to tell myself, that we all have to step out into a space of courage, and it's not comfortable. But if we lose our rights to our land, if we lose our access to being sovereign nations, if we lose all of the agreements that were made in the trade for land, that includes education, that includes healthcare, that includes other functions so that we can function as sovereign government. And so we need your courage, because legislators only know what they know, right? So like, we're supposed to be here serving a community that's like 30 to 40,000 constituents. But if you're not speaking out and you're not engaging and you're not sharing your needs consistently, then who can we be mad at if they don't know what they don't know and we're not helping to educate them? Because I have learned a lot, because I've listened to community members share the things that matter to them. And so I want you to do that. And I want to tell you that there is a pattern of how, when, and who you talk to in decision making. And so one of the things, and I shared it, and I don't know if there's an easy way for us to put it up, but there's a map of when each state is in session. Because Alfred, are you looking for it? I look like your eyes are looking for it. Yeah, okay. It's really interesting. I didn't know this before I was elected. Y'all know, right, that you have a state legislature. And we all know that they probably go into session. You probably know where your state capital is at. But does anybody know what day do they go into session? How often are they in session? Do they meet every year at the same? So this is an example of the 2022 legislative calendar. It's every state, and it tells you when they go into session. Like, see, we're beginning of January. Some people don't go in until March. Some people are done in March, April, May. So every state is different. There's also some states that have veto sessions. There's some states that come back for follow-up. So if we could share this out with the other stuff that's being shared out, look at this. Look and have this readily available so that you know when the decision makers in your state are making massive decisions. Okay, you can close that out. If we can just make sure that that link gets shared out, because I do think that that's really helpful, and there's interesting information on that. The other thing is your state might have two different sessions. So here in Minnesota, as the state representative, we serve 2 terms. The first term is a budget year, and we're in beginning of January until the middle of May. And that's when we decide the entire state budget. The second year, we go in at the end of January because it's a policy bonding year. So like this last year, we were looking over all of the policies and our big bonding projects. And so it is important to know that. And I'll tell you why. And it's important to have that information shareable for your students and their families, because the best advocacy only happens when you know when and how to make it hit. Because I'll tell you, there are times in May at the end of session when we've done all of this work and new groups are coming to me saying, hey, we really need money for this. Hey, we really want you to change this policy. We need to meet with you. And that is not a time, a place, or an emotional space that I can have those engaging conversations. For me, the best time to work on policy is actually November and December, because it's after the election and it's before we go into session. We have what are committee hearings, which is where your voice is actually the most powerful, because we ask and we invite community members. I always invited students, teachers from tribal schools, the presidents of our tribal colleges to show up and be a voice in those committees. And anybody can do that. That's open to the public. The government, you have access to. So know when that cycle starts, because the beginning of every session is going to be when it's time for the community to show up. And you may have 2 to 3 minutes to express why whatever the bill is either harmful or helpful. And a lot of people think that, well, we get involved in legislation for the changes that we want to see for our students, like LGBTQIA funding. You know, right now there's a ton of funding for Indian education, right? Like we get funds to support Native American students in spaces, but there are no funds particularly that help our LGBTQIA communities and our families. So having a ton of different people from different areas show up and support would be massive. But the bigger part is that I feel like we do more defense in like all of the really bad bills. Like there's language out there. So again, like I mentioned, my son has 2 moms. You know, there's bills out there that will potentially risk the fact of me losing my parental rights to my kids because because Elliot has 2 moms. They would feel that I am like it's child abuse or child neglect. And so some of what we do is write really awesome bills to give funding out to these great ideas. The other thing that we do is the defense. And so that's when engaging as community members is so important. And sometimes your voice is actually the most powerful voice for your students. Because often, like, nobody is voiceless, right? We all have a voice. We all have a right to use our voice. We all have a way to use our voice. But sometimes others need help lifting up their voice. And you all, as adults and leaders in your spaces, can really help people do that. And I think that it goes back to filling the seats. When I passed Indigenous Peoples Day, is we start to plant the seeds of your students to be involved in the change that they want to see in their communities. And I know that like the white government is not always the easiest way to do it, but the reality is that's the path that we need to engage in. And it's scary and it's terrifying. And I will tell you that, you know, here in Minnesota, we've even tried to create bills that make Minnesota a safe haven state, that if adults are providing gender affirming medications for their child, other states would say that's child neglect. And we put forth legislation that would make Minnesota a safe state for families and youth to come to. But on the flip side of that, on the day that we were listening to the education policy omnibus on the House floor, the first part of that day, I had to sit through listening to people tell me that as an Indigenous person, we're just made up and we don't really exist and we're just trying to get money from the government. Like literally, like this was over and over and over and over. And then it transitioned into as a Two-Spirit or LGBTQIA individual, you know, all the things that are awful about that. So there was 16 hours on the House floor of listening to that over and over and over. And we have to sit there and we have to take it. But on the flip side, I had the courage and I didn't do it well. Don't go Google it. Don't look at it because I didn't do it well. But I stood up on the House floor and I talked about Dakota 38+2 because everybody was telling us, you know, that we were so horrible and so bad, that the truth is, I don't think anybody ever in the history of the 92 sessions of the state legislature, anybody stood up and talked about that. But I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for my college professors. And I want that to sit with you because you all have a massive link to make a difference in our next generation. Whether that's learn, you know, they don't have to become state representatives, but if we give them the tools to know how to engage in the change, if you want funding or you want policy to be able to create whatever it is for your Two-Spirit students in your state at your university, the first path to do that is teach them how to have a path to be a voice at the table of change. And if you push and push and push and push and things don't change, then how do we get more people there? Like, we cannot give up. Our next generations need us to be at the table to have these conversations, because I am telling you all, it is so hard to do this work because I have to put myself on the line. Like, people come in and do this work and they care about businesses and they care about balloons and they care about hot tubs, you know, and those are things. And I come in and I do this work and I care about our Indigenous queer next generation. And it's hard to do. And we have to teach each other where these difficult conversations are happening, who's having them. There is a map. Alfred, can you pull up the Victory Fund map? So if you all want to know who your leaders are in your communities, this map, and it's not all inclusive because I'm sure we're missing some, but it's a really cool map to utilize. Who are your Two-Spirit? Who are your LGBTQIA leaders in your state? So the Victory Fund is a national organization that supports LGBTQIA candidates. That's their whole mission. Okay, so just go to the state of Minnesota. And you can do this every state. I mean, you can go to Colorado, you can do, yeah, so there's all of the candidates. Those are all of the members. There's me. And it's awesome because in the state of Minnesota, because we've been speaking up in legislation, because we've been speaking up in spaces, we now have 11 out and proud queer candidates that are running for seats in our state legislature. So when we talk about representation and that it matters, not only as Indigenous people, but as intersectionality individuals, as people of the Two-Spirit world, it is important that we show up. So if maybe this link could go out with the information too, so you all could look and see, or just go to victoryfund.com and then you can look in your state. And it goes all the way down to city council and school board. I have asked them to include tribal council so that could be something that's added on there as well, because again, we are government entities within our state. We should be part of that map, because I also believe that our numbers will look different if we look at our tribal governments as well. So I won't keep going on and on. I feel like I always could, but just be mindful that all of us have an opportunity to step into some courage. And I really believe in the 7-generation belief system that it is really hard for me. And I have to do a lot of self-care and I have to do a lot of community healing with other people in my life. I'm a jingle dress dancer and I have to take time to get back into the circle to heal in this work. And so, be kind to each other. When you see your state is going through really difficult things, send a letter to your legislator and just let them know that you see them, that you appreciate their work, because we don't really get that a whole lot. So especially if you see non-Native or straight members trying to be a voice and advocate because we aren't at those tables, let them know that that's meaningful, because we are humans in this work and we're trying to do the very best that we can by sharing our own space, our own story, and our own courage. So with that, I'll stop. If anybody, I know that there was a ton of questions, but what I've learned in these Zoom, if I start reading the questions, I get squirreled way too easily and then I don't really go back to them. So did anybody have any questions for me particularly, or are the questions in the chat more just amongst each other?
I think there was just kind of conversation back and forth, but we can open it up if anyone is comfortable just asking a question right now to go ahead. We just want a couple minutes at the end just to share a couple of things that will be coming up, because this is one of many sessions that we'll be hosting. So yeah, if you want to ask questions, go ahead.
Not all at once, right? All the people. So one of the things I also like to share is I'm so much more than just a representative. I believe that I have to make changes in all of the capacities that I can. And so I sit as a representative part of the time, making changes through legislation. I also launched my own business consulting agency. And so I go out and I call it Indigenous 101, all the things you didn't learn in K-12, that I do educational conversations with communities, organizations, education institutions, and healthcare systems. And then the third hat I wear is I'm a motivational speaker, and I have a podcast that I'm developing to try to drop like seeds of belief and seeds of hope, because I believe that I was gifted, whatever this gift is, to be in these spaces at this time. So if, after we have this conversation and as you all go back to your communities, if there's anything that I can help with, outside of this, please reach out to me. I'm not really in it for any reason other than I want to be able to make the biggest impacts that I can. So info@twofeathersllc.com is my email. Let me put it. Oh, everyone. So if anybody wants to email, has questions, has suggestions, LGBT. Oh, all the questions went away. Sorry.
Sorry, Heather, I think we can have Kai kind of moderate the chat.
Oh, good. Thanks. I feel like I was trying to, and all the screens keep changing.
I think for the most part, like questions right now are kind of about following up and people wanting to follow up and making sure that they have access to information. Ethylene, I'm not sure, can we have access to your videos for LGBTQ plus students? Are you asking that for just this conversation in general, specifically to Heather? Just so that we make sure we get that information to you.
So let me ask this back to the group. If you could like raise your hand in the emojis or whatever, give me like some smiley faces or something. Do you think it would be beneficial to have like series of conversations for your Two-Spirit students? Because like we have student organizations in a lot of the bigger universities where students of like-minded either lifestyles or majors, like there's all kinds of student organizations. But what I fear and what I hear, especially in Minnesota, is there's not many Two-Spirit Indigenous students out there in some of our tribal colleges, that if you have one or two, like would it maybe be beneficial if we could start some sort of a virtual student organization? I mean, I know that like that's not the same as being in the same place, but would that be something that your schools would be willing to buy into, be willing to promote, be willing to kind of help host and direct students? Because it's one of the things that's been swimming around in my mind that I feel is a big gap and is a big miss in our tribal community college with our Two-Spirit individuals. So if that's something that people feel maybe something good for your students, let me know.
So that's actually a great segue and question. I can see the chat going pretty wild right now in terms of probably people saying yes. So part of this initiative actually is we're going to be hosting a knowledge sharing virtual series, and I'm not sure if all of you are aware, but we're also investing in the college fund internal capacity as an organization. And so on Monday, we hosted a conversation as well and had a guest speaker. And so we're attempting to simultaneously build our own organizational knowledge and capacity and understanding in this space so that we can also better support our tribal colleges and universities. And so this conversation, like I had mentioned, is one of many. We are actually, I have here that it's through June 2023, but we have been funded to engage in this work for the next 4 years, which is very exciting. And we hope to have additional speakers and continue to engage speakers that we've been had the privilege of having join us. And so these are some of the things that we will be talking about, going more in depth into the history. I know that Alfred shared some kind of like a brief overview earlier, but there's, and I've heard Alfred mention before that there's like an entire culture, yes, around Two-Spirit people, but just around like the LGBTQ movement. And this actually, I was thinking about this earlier, Representative Keeler, when you were talking about visibility. and terms in the 90s specifically. And, you know, and I briefly talked with Alfred about this as well. I'm 43, and thinking about that time period and now, you know, visibility is a double-edged sword. Visibility can change things, and at the same time, when you put yourself out there, when you put yourself on the front lines, it can mean endangerment. But then thinking back to the ability now, because of visibility, the increased ability for myself, but also our youth, to articulate who they are, to have options and ways that they identify. And it's not just labels, and it's not just a name. It is their ability to like question, like, where am I, that this is a spectrum. And so it was interesting when you said that. I was like, the 90s, and I too, you know, I identified as androgynous, as gay, and then I was like, oh, I'm queer, and I just didn't have the terms, you know, and it took me a long time actually to consider transitioning, you know, and even in my transitioning, you know, I'm not transitioning from female to male, I'm just changing because I'm always changing. And so I appreciate that acknowledgement. And that's something to keep in mind when you're engaging with, you know, again, as faculty members, in your own identity, leadership, students, community members. And Alfred had mentioned this earlier, that just because someone identifies in one way does not mean that that won't change. We're ever evolving, all of us. And so to remember to listen for that. And if someone tells you I'm changing, are you sure? Are you sure you're, you know, like, you know, let them tell you who they are, how they're changing. So
Can I add one thing to that?
Yeah.
That I had in my notes that I wanted to mention is their name. And, you know, it's one of the things that we talk about a lot, that when students come to college, we see that that is a time that is a safe time to transition, because they're moving out of their home. Maybe their parents or the adults in their life in high school, you know, were some of their biggest harmful relationships. And so making sure that there is a way for students to write, you know, their preferred name, and that that's what's showing up on your class list, so that like as you're meeting students or, you know, reaching out to them, that you're using the name that they prefer. I know that we see that a lot more in the K-12 systems, that, you know, because we have to follow what it says on a birth certificate or things like that, that teachers will always go back to the dead name and not utilize the name in which the individual wants to utilize. So making sure that their system's set up now that students are back or coming back shortly, that there is a data system in a way that you look at your students to know that you're using their preferred name in those spaces. Sorry to jump in. That was just one of the things I made a note of that I wanted to make sure to share with all of you.
Yeah, can I add one layer of that? For folks who are at TCUs who might be in like IT or administration or any kind of support role, you might not think that this might necessarily apply to you or be questioning, but no, when I was at the foundation, those were the biggest champions that we found, were people who were in administrative and operations, because they had the ability to change the programming or change the software or to change the forms, right? And so all of that seems really minute, and it seems one of those things that we don't really think about, but it is one of the first barriers that Two-Spirit LGBTQ folks get to, right? So like I've filled out forms where it's like, your salutation is a required field. So Mr., Miss, Mrs., right? Like, it's like, none of that, none of that is applicable to me. So, but those are really small changes that can help, and there are ways to be able to. And if you have friends in the IT department, if you have friends in administration who might not think that they have the ability to change that policy, you actually probably do.
Oh, I was on mute. I am going to drop a link in here that is an evaluation link. If you all can please take a couple minutes to go in and fill that out. That way that as we continue to move forward in this work, we can be considerate of the things that you're interested in learning. We have been opening this up. You know, we did initially, we reached out to presidents, to admin, to faculty and staff, students, but we know that that we are all family members. Our students have family members, and it's beneficial for them to learn alongside the students. And so we really look forward to continuing this work. We will be hosting one of our first virtual knowledge sharing sessions in October, and we'll be sharing that. But Alfred, I wanted to check in with you and see if you had any follow-ups or anything else really quickly.
Yep, everything that you'll be that you've requested will be available to you. I think by next Wednesday is when I set my own internal deadline. So you'll be able to receive all the resources that we shared today. And then I also wanted to share with you just how to stay in touch here. This is where I am. You can reach me at walkingbull.com, Alfred at walkingbull.com, or you can follow me on all of the social medias at Hoyekiyapi. And if you have your smart device, you can turn your camera on and scan that QR code to get you to all those places, to my website. And Heather, I made one for you too. So if you can get a hold of Heather at twofeathersllc.com, info at twofeathersllc.com, Facebook, and then I made you a QR code too, Heather. So you will be receiving this, I think, hopefully by Wednesday is my deadline, probably Monday. I just like to give myself a day or two.
We will be sharing out the slides, which also includes links to Alfred and to contact Representative Keeler as well. And again, if you have questions, feel free to follow up with us, but also provide them in the evaluation so that we can address them more broadly in conversation. And if there's anything else that anyone has, we have just 1 minute left. Otherwise, thank you all very much for joining us, and we look forward to being together again. And thank you again, Representative Keeler. I learned a lot. So thank you again, Alfred.
Thank you all. Pilamae wopla tanke chichiapelo. Doksha ake.
Doksha ake wachiake kde.
Brown, then you're down for the old pain. Look at all around, look around at the whole thing. If your skin is brown, then you're down for the old pain.